Most people assume a tropical retirement means leaving the US or spending Hawaii-level money. But Saipan quietly breaks that belief. Based on publicly available geographic and residency information, Saipan is a U.S. territory in the Western Pacific, where Americans can live without visas or foreign residency rules. Yet it feels worlds away from mainland stress. This small island blends white sand beaches, warm, clear water, and a slower pace with U.S. citizenship protections, which is why it keeps surprising people who research affordable island retirement options. And that's before looking at what daily life actually costs there. Why Saipan feels impossible to most people. Saipan feels unrealistic to most Americans because it lives outside the stories we're used to hearing about retirement and island living. When you look at official territorial records and widely published location data, Saipan sits so far from the mainland that many people subconsciously categorize it as foreign, even though it legally isn't. You'll notice that anything this distant rarely shows up in mainstream retirement conversations, travel shows, or real estate discussions, which quietly reinforces the idea that it must be complicated, expensive, or off-limits. Honestly, most people never question that assumption because Saipan doesn't fit the familiar Florida or Hawaii framework, and its smaller population and lower tourism visibility make it easy to overlook. Locals often say the island's biggest obstacle isn't infrastructure or lifestyle, but awareness. Because once people realize Saipan operates under U.S. territorial law and supports everyday American life, the sense of impossibility starts to fall apart, which naturally leads to the legal reality that changes how people view living there altogether. The legal reality that changes the conversation. What completely reshapes how people see Saipan is its legal status, because despite how distant it feels, it operates under U.S. territorial law in a way many Americans don't realize. Based on publicly available federal and territorial governance information, Saipan is part of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, which means U.S. citizens can live there without visas, residency permits, or foreign ownership restrictions that apply in other tropical destinations. You'll notice this immediately changes the equation, since everyday life follows U.S. systems for identification, employment eligibility, and basic civil protections. Even though the culture and landscape feel distinctly Pacific, honestly, this is the detail that quietly separates Saipan from almost every other cheap tropical retirement location people talk about, because it removes layers of bureaucracy that often scare retirees away before they even research further. Locals often point out that this legal clarity is why some people settle in without ever thinking of themselves as living abroad, which naturally leads to the next question people ask once the paperwork worry disappears. Where exactly Saipan is, and how reachable it really feels. Where Saipan actually is, and why that matters. Saipan's location is the detail that instantly reshapes how people judge it. Because based on publicly available geographic records, this island sits in the Western Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from the continental United States, and far closer to East Asia than most Americans realize. Saipan is part of the Northern Mariana Islands chain, north of Guam and south of Japan, which explains why flights from places like Tokyo are significantly shorter than trips from the U.S. mainland. A reality that quietly influences everything from tourism patterns to daily life logistics. You'll notice this distance creates a psychological gap, making Saipan feel disconnected from American life, even though it remains fully tied to the U.S. politically and legally. Honestly, that remoteness is a double-edged sword, because it limits crowds and overdevelopment while also shaping how goods, travel, and connections flow on and off the island. Locals often describe Saipan as isolated but not cut off, a place where the pace slows down precisely because it sits outside major mainland traffic corridors, which leads directly into the question most people ask next once they understand the map. What does everyday life on Saipan actually feel like? The distance factor. Nobody mentions. What most people quietly struggle with when they first hear about Saipan isn't legality or cost. It's distance. Because based on publicly available aviation and geographic data, Saipan sits nearly 9 hours by air from Hawaii and far longer from most mainland U.S. hubs, which immediately triggers the thought that it must be impractical for everyday life. You'll notice that this reaction is emotional as much as logistical, since Americans are conditioned to think anything that far away is unreachable, even though the island maintains regular commercial air connections through regional hubs and nearby Pacific cities. Honestly, the surprising part is that Saipan's distance reshapes lifestyle more than convenience, because fewer impulse trips and limited flight options naturally slow the pace of life, reduce crowds, and filter out short-term tourism that overwhelms other tropical destinations. Locals often describe this remoteness as a kind of built-in peace, where daily routines feel calmer precisely because the island is not a quick weekend escape, which leads directly into what daily life actually looks like once you're there. What daily life in Saipan really feels like. Daily life in Saipan feels dramatically different from what most Americans expect, because based on publicly available population and infrastructure data, this is a small island where routines revolve around community, geography, and time rather than schedules and congestion. You'll notice quickly that driving is essential since public transportation is limited, but commutes are short and traffic is minimal, which quietly removes a daily stressor many retirees don't realize they're carrying. Honestly, the rhythm of life slows down here in a way that feels intentional, with mornings shaped by ocean views, local markets, and neighborhood interactions rather than packed calendars. Much of island life centers around Garapan, where shops, restaurants, and beaches sit within close reach, creating a social core that balances convenience with a relaxed atmosphere. Locals often describe the lifestyle as simple but not empty, where access to beaches, outdoor activities, and familiar American goods blends with Pacific Island culture, which naturally leads into the question of how Saipan's outdoor environment shapes everyday living even more. Beaches, water, and the outdoor lifestyle. Saipan's outdoor lifestyle feels less like a perk and more like the default setting, largely because the island is surrounded by shallow lagoons, coral reefs, and long stretches of accessible shoreline that shape everyday routines. You'll notice that swimming, snorkeling, and casual beach walks are woven into daily life rather than planned around weekends or seasons, helped by warm ocean temperatures and clear water that remain consistent throughout the year. Honestly, what catches many people off guard is how much of the coastline remains lightly developed, creating a sense of openness that's rare in more heavily marketed tropical destinations. Iconic dive and snorkel locations draw visitors from around the world, yet residents experience these same spots without crowds, turning world-class scenery into something ordinary and calming. This constant connection to nature subtly influences how people structure their days, which explains why leisure activities and low-pressure outdoor time become central to life here, and naturally lead into why golf and slow-paced recreation fit so seamlessly into Saipan's retirement appeal. Golf, leisure, and why retirees settle in. Leisure plays a bigger role in Saipan than many people expect, which helps explain why retirees often settle into life here more comfortably than they imagined. Based on publicly available tourism and recreation data, the island supports multiple championship-level golf courses set along ocean cliffs and coastal plains, including layouts designed to be playable year-round thanks to Saipan's stable climate. You'll notice that golf here is less about exclusivity and more about time, where rounds unfold without pressure, crowds, or long waits, turning the sport into a social rhythm rather than a scheduled event. Honestly, this slower pace is what draws many retirees in, since activities like golfing, walking, and casual social gatherings replace the constant rush found elsewhere. The combination of accessible leisure, scenic surroundings, and a community that values unhurried days creates an environment where people feel comfortable staying long-term, which naturally leads to the next question. Once lifestyle fits into place, what the numbers actually look like when it comes to everyday living costs. Cost of living. The numbers that change minds. The moment people stop guessing and start looking at the numbers, Saipan suddenly feels very different. Based on publicly available cost of living and housing data, everyday expenses on the island land in a middle ground by US standards. Not ultra cheap, but noticeably lower than many major coastal cities. You'll notice that housing is often the biggest surprise, since average prices for modest two-bedroom homes have historically hovered far below what retirees are used to seeing in places like California or Hawaii, while rents reflect the island's smaller scale rather than luxury demand. Grocery costs can run higher for imported items, but transportation, entertainment, and daily services tend to offset that, creating a more balanced monthly picture than most people expect. Honestly, when comparisons are made, Saipan often comes out significantly cheaper than large metro areas like Los Angeles and closer to mid-sized mainland cities in overall spending, which reframes it from remote fantasy to financially possible, and naturally leads to the next concern most people raise once the math makes sense. What healthcare access actually looks like on the island. Healthcare. The honest reality. Healthcare is the point where expectations need to be grounded in reality, and Saipan is no exception. Based on publicly available territorial health system information, the island is served primarily by a central hospital and outpatient clinics that handle routine care, emergency services, and many common medical needs, which supports day-to-day life but does not mirror the depth of large mainland hospital networks. You'll notice that serious or highly specialized treatments often require travel to nearby regional hubs such as Guam or East Asia, a factor that shapes how residents think about long-term living without turning it into a deal-breaker for everyone. Honestly, this limitation is neither hidden nor exaggerated by locals, who tend to view healthcare access as adequate for everyday needs while acknowledging the island's scale. This transparent reality is part of what keeps expectations realistic and leads many people to weigh healthcare alongside lifestyle, weather, and community when evaluating Saipan as a retirement option, which naturally brings up the next surprising detail that often catches people off guard: the island's unusually stable climate. The weather statistic that sounds unreal. The climate is where Saipan starts to sound almost exaggerated, yet the data backs it up. Based on publicly available meteorological records, Saipan holds a world record for having one of the most consistent temperature ranges on Earth, with average lows and highs staying within a remarkably narrow band throughout the year. You'll notice that this means no true winter, no extreme heat spikes, and very little day-to-day variation, which quietly removes the seasonal stress many retirees experience on the mainland. Honestly, this level of stability reshapes daily routines, since outdoor plans rarely need weather contingencies and life unfolds with fewer interruptions. While tropical storms are part of the broader Pacific reality, most days are defined by steady warmth, ocean breezes, and predictable conditions that locals rely on rather than worry about. This unusual climate consistency is a major reason outdoor living feels effortless here and sets the stage for understanding who actually lives on the island and why they choose to stay. Who lives in Saipan? Understanding who lives in Saipan helps explain why the island feels so different from most American retirement destinations. Based on publicly available population and census data, Saipan is home to a diverse mix of cultures, with large portions of the population tracing their roots to Chamorro and Carolinian heritage, alongside residents with broader Pacific Island and Asian backgrounds, and a smaller percentage of mainland Americans. You'll notice that this diversity shapes everyday life, from food and language to community events and social norms, creating an environment that feels international yet familiar. Honestly, many newcomers are surprised by how welcoming the island feels. Partly because Saipan's smaller population encourages stronger social connections and a sense of shared space. Long-term residents often describe the community as close-knit without being insular, where retirees blend in more naturally than expected because the pace of life values respect and routine over status or speed. This social fabric, built over generations, adds emotional depth to daily living and naturally leads into Saipan's layered history, which is still visible across the island today. A history you can walk through. Saipan's history isn't tucked away in museums or textbooks. It's part of the landscape you move through every day. Based on publicly available historical records, the island has been inhabited for thousands of years by the Chamorro people, followed by periods of Spanish, German, and Japanese rule before becoming a pivotal location during World War II. You'll notice remnants of these eras everywhere, from ancient latte stone sites to coastal cliffs and inland fields that still carry visible traces of wartime fortifications. Honestly, what surprises many people is how seamlessly this history blends into normal life, where a morning walk might pass a quiet memorial or a shoreline that once played a strategic role in global events. The island's role in shaping Pacific history gives everyday surroundings a deeper context, creating a sense that life here is layered rather than isolated, which naturally leads into the emotional impact of living in a place where the past is still present. The emotional side of living here. Living in Saipan carries an emotional weight that many people don't anticipate until they experience it firsthand. Based on publicly available cultural and historical information, the island's past is closely tied to moments of resilience, loss, and survival, which creates an atmosphere that feels reflective rather than rushed. You'll notice that places like coastal cliffs, quiet memorials, and preserved landmarks invite pause and contemplation, subtly influencing how residents relate to time and daily life. Honestly, this emotional undercurrent often reshapes priorities, as people find themselves slowing down, listening more, and becoming more present in ways that feel difficult on the mainland. Locals often describe a shared respect for both nature and history that encourages mindfulness rather than distraction, creating a deeper connection to place that goes beyond scenery. This emotional grounding is part of what makes Saipan feel meaningful to those who stay. Which brings up the practical question many people ask next once they feel connected: how safe the island is, and how residents handle environmental risks. Storms, safety, and risk perception. Storms are often the first concern people raise about Saipan, yet the reality is more nuanced than the fear suggests. Based on publicly available regional climate and safety data, Saipan sits in the Western Pacific, where tropical storms and typhoons are part of the broader environment, but they are not constant events, and preparedness is built into how the island functions. You'll notice that local infrastructure, building practices, and community response systems reflect long experience with weather events, which reduces panic and increases resilience when conditions shift. Honestly, Risk perception is shaped more by headlines than by everyday life, as most days are calm and predictable, and serious weather tends to be monitored well in advance. Rather than arriving without warning, crime rates on the island are generally low compared to many mainland urban areas, contributing to a sense of personal safety that surprises many newcomers. This balance between environmental awareness and daily calm is part of what defines life here and leads naturally into how Saipan compares with other well-known tropical retirement destinations Americans already recognize. Saipan versus Hawaii. The comparison people care about. The moment Saipan enters the conversation, Hawaii naturally becomes the reference point. But the contrast between the two is sharper than most people expect. Based on publicly available cost of living and tourism data, Hawaii's popularity comes with dense crowds, high housing prices, and daily expenses that consistently rank among the highest in the United States, while Saipan operates on a much quieter scale shaped by limited tourism and lower demand pressure. You'll notice that both offer warm water, palm-lined beaches, and year-round outdoor living, yet the experience diverges quickly once daily routines begin. Since Saipan lacks the traffic congestion, packed resorts, and constant visitor turnover that define many Hawaiian communities. Honestly, what surprises people most is that Saipan delivers a similar natural setting without the same financial strain or sensory overload, trading convenience and choice for calm and space. This difference doesn't make one better than the other, but it reframes Saipan as an alternative that prioritizes simplicity over spectacle, which leads directly into why remoteness itself becomes an advantage rather than a drawback for some retirees. Why remoteness becomes a feature. Remoteness is usually framed as a disadvantage, but in Saipan, it quietly becomes one of the island's strongest features. Based on publicly available infrastructure and population data, the distance from major mainland hubs limits overdevelopment, controls crowd size, and keeps daily life from being shaped by constant outside demand. You'll notice that this separation filters out short-term tourism and high-pressure growth, allowing routines to remain steady and community-focused rather than reactive. Honestly, many residents describe the remoteness as a form of relief, since fewer distractions and less noise create space for consistency and calm. Essential services, commerce, and social life still function normally, but without the urgency and overload common in more connected places. This physical distance subtly reshapes mental priorities, which helps explain why many retirees experience a noticeable psychological shift after settling in, leading directly into how life begins to feel different on a deeper level. The psychological shift retirees experience. Life in Saipan tends to change how people process time without them even realizing it at first. Research on small, low-density communities shows that environments with minimal traffic, predictable routines, and close proximity to nature naturally reduce mental strain. And Saipan reflects that dynamic clearly. You'll notice days unfolding without constant urgency, where decisions feel less pressured and interruptions become rare. Honestly, many people are caught off guard by how quickly long-held stress patterns loosen, replaced by a calmer internal pace. This quiet mental adjustment becomes one of the island's strongest draws, which helps explain why Saipan stays memorable long after the novelty fades and sets up why it remains so overlooked. Why Saipan stays forgotten. Saipan stays off most people's radar because it exists far outside the usual attention cycle that keeps destinations popular. The island isn't pushed through aggressive tourism campaigns, doesn't dominate travel algorithms, and rarely shows up in mainstream retirement discussions that favor easily recognizable names. You'll notice that places gain popularity when convenience, hype, and constant exposure align. And Saipan quietly avoids all three by design and circumstance. Honestly, its distance limits casual curiosity, while its smaller scale keeps it from chasing growth at any cost, allowing daily life to remain steady instead of performative. This combination makes Saipan easy to overlook, but hard to replace once discovered, setting up the final moment that challenges how retirement itself is usually imagined. The moment that changes how retirement looks. Looking at Saipan through its legal status, lifestyle, and cost realities quietly breaks the assumption that retirement has to be crowded, expensive, or overseas. It reveals that some American places still exist outside the pressure cycle, where distance filters noise and simplicity reshapes priorities. And that realization changes the question entirely.